The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. It was the kind of evening that felt like it could be straight out of a peaceful family photo, a time when everything was supposed to feel safe, calm, and protected. But for Jamal, nothing felt safe anymore. He sat on the porch, the cool breeze brushing against his skin, staring at the small, weathered house in front of him. His hands rested lightly on the armrests of his wheelchair, the metal cold under his fingertips. The world seemed to move around him, unaware of the storm that was brewing inside him. His cat, a scruffy little tabby with soft fur and a mischievous streak, jumped up onto his lap. Jamal gently scratched behind the cat's ears, the simple act bringing a small sense of comfort. It was his cat, the one creature who had never judged him, never made him feel invisible. For years, it had been his companion through the hardest moments, offering silent support when no one else would. But Jamal knew it wouldn't last. Not today. Not now. The sound of a car engine broke the stillness, distant at first, then growing louder. Jamal's body tensed instinctively. He knew who it was. He always knew when Officer Davis was around. It wasn't just the sound of the police car. Jamal could feel it, deep in his bones. The officer had been harassing him and his family for months. He had come to see Jamal as nothing more than a target for his cruelty. A reminder that people like Jamal didn't belong in the world the officer had built. Jamal's mother, a woman with a heart as big as the world but a life worn thin by struggle, stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with worry. She had seen it too. The same fear, the same tightening in her chest every time Officer Davis made his rounds. But today, something was different. Jamal could feel it. The car pulled up, the engine rumbling to a stop in front of the house. Officer Davis stepped out, his uniform sharp against the fading light. His face was stern, almost robotic, as he glanced over at Jamal, but there was something else in his eyes, something darker. Jamal's heart began to race. This wasn't like all the other times, when the officer had simply driven by, eyes narrowed, making his presence known in that silent, suffocating way that left Jamal feeling small. No, this was something else. Jamal's cat, sensing the shift in energy, began to squirm in his lap, its soft purring turning into nervous meows. He tried to calm it down, but the animal was already on edge, as if it knew that something bad was about to happen. Without a word, Officer Davis approached, his boots crunching against the gravel as he walked toward Jamal's porch. Jamal felt his stomach tighten. He had endured so much at this man's hands already. The words, the insults, the taunts. "What's the matter, cripple? Can't even get out of your chair? Maybe you're better off staying here where you can't make the rest of us uncomfortable." It had all hurt. But today something else burned inside Jamal, a fire he hadn't felt before. Today, he wouldn't sit quietly. Today, he wouldn't let the officer treat him like he was nothing. The officer stopped in front of him, eyes narrowing as he looked down at Jamal. There was that familiar sneer, that mockery in his gaze. "You should be careful, boy," Officer Davis said, his voice low and dripping with disdain. "You don't want to push me too far." Jamal swallowed hard, his hands tightening on the wheels of his chair. His chest was tight, his breath shallow. The storm inside him was rising, pushing him to speak, to act, to do something that would change everything. And then, in one swift, cruel motion, Officer Davis reached down, grabbed the cat by the scruff of its neck, and tossed it aside like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. Jamal froze. The cat landed hard on the concrete, its body crumpling as it tried to get to its feet. Jamal's heart stopped. Time seemed to slow. He couldn't breathe. His mind was a blur of rage and disbelief. His cat, the only companion he had, the one thing in this world that had shown him love without judgment, was now lying in a heap on the ground. "Get out of here, little animal!" Officer Davis sneered, stepping forward to drive his boot into the cat's side, sending it scrambling away in fear. Jamal's chest burned. It was too much. The years of humiliation, the years of being told he was worthless. This was the breaking point. This was no longer just about surviving. This was about something more. "Stop!" Jamal shouted, his voice breaking as he struggled to push himself up from the chair. Don't you dare touch it again. The officer didn't flinch. He took another step forward, towering over Jamal, a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. Make me, Officer Davis said, his voice low and dangerous. Jamal's pulse was pounding in his ears now. The world felt like it was closing in around him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. But in the distance, in the back of his mind, something clicked. A voice, quiet but steady, whispered to him, "This is it. This is where you stand up." For the first time in his life, Jamal didn't hesitate. His hands moved with purpose, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. He grabbed the wheels of his chair, his arms burning as he pushed with everything he had, ramming the chair into Officer Davis's legs. The officer stumbled back in surprise, the smirk fading from his face. For a split second, Jamal saw something in his eyes. Fear. Fear of someone who was no longer willing to be the victim. Jamal stared up at the officer, his voice steady and full of quiet fury. "You don't get to do this anymore." The officer stood tall, his hands twitching at his sides. But something had changed. The balance had shifted, and the storm inside Jamal was only just beginning. The moment hung in the air, charged with tension. Neither of them moved, both aware that this was no longer just a confrontation. This was a turning point, and nothing would ever be the same again. Jamal's hands were still gripping the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white with the tension that coursed through him. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Officer Davis pulsed in his veins, but it was quickly being replaced by a slow, cold burn, the kind that came from standing on the edge of something larger than himself. He had pushed back for the first time in his life. He had made the officer take a step back. But what now? What would happen next? As Officer Davis sputtered in shock, stumbling backwards, Jamal saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. The officer wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being challenged, not by someone like Jamal. And in that brief moment, Jamal felt a rush of something he hadn't known in years. Control. For the first time, Jamal wasn't just a passive victim of the system. He was a force pushing back. It felt like freedom. The officer's eyes narrowed, and Jamal could see the anger boiling beneath the surface. He had pushed Davis into something unexpected, something dangerous. He had exposed the officer's fragile ego, and now Jamal was certain the officer would not back down easily. "You think you're tough now, huh?" Officer Davis spat, his voice laced with venom. His hand was close to his holster, and Jamal knew, with a sickening certainty, that if he didn't back off, the officer wouldn't hesitate to escalate this further. The moment was dangerous. It was no longer just about the cat. It was about power. The balance of power had shifted in the small interaction, but it wasn't over yet. But Jamal didn't flinch. His heart pounded. Not from fear, but from a growing understanding. This wasn't just about one cop's cruelty. This was about everything. Every look, every word, every injustice he had suffered at the hands of people who saw him as lesser. The storm inside him wasn't just rage anymore. It was clarity. For too long, he had been told his life didn't matter. For too long, he had been made to feel small, invisible. But now, standing here in front of Officer Davis, he understood something crucial. His life mattered. His voice mattered. And this time, he would not be silenced. The officer took another step forward, but Jamal didn't retreat. Instead, he pushed himself up, his muscles aching as he propelled his chair forward, defiantly closing the distance between them. "I said don't touch it," Jamal repeated, his voice no longer breaking but strong, filled with authority. "Don't ever lay a hand on me or my family again." The officer stopped. His eyes flickered, calculating, trying to measure the shift in power. And for a second, Jamal thought he might back down, that he might retreat. But then Davis did what Jamal had expected. He laughed, a bitter, mocking laugh that rang out into the quiet evening air. The kind of laugh that made Jamal feel like the joke was on him, made him feel small again. But this time, he didn't react. Officer Davis stepped back, his hands going to his radio, signaling for backup. "You think you can stand up to me, boy?" His voice had gone cold, all traces of doubt vanishing into a deep, hateful certainty. "You think just because you're not in your place, just because you think you can get away with this, that things will change. You don't know how this works. I make the rules around here. Jamal clenched his jaw. The words stung, but they no longer held the same power. They didn't scare him anymore. They just showed how deep the officer's hatred ran, how comfortable he was in his position of power. But the officer's tone was also a warning. This wasn't just a random interaction. The officer had made it clear that Jamal's defiance wasn't something he was going to let slide. "You'll regret this," Officer Davis sneered as he turned away to leave. "You should be careful who you mess with. People like me, we own this town." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but he remained calm. He wasn't done. This was just the beginning. He had stood up to the officer. He had pushed back, and in doing so, he had made a mark. But Jamal knew it wasn't over. There would be consequences. There always were. The following days were filled with a kind of strange calm. The officer had left, but the unease lingered. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something that would come back to haunt him. Officer Davis had made it clear that he wasn't the kind of person who would take being challenged lightly. The community whispered about it. People knew Jamal had done something they never thought possible, and in some ways, they were proud of him, proud that he had finally stood up to the officer. But Jamal wasn't sure if he had done the right thing. Part of him felt the rush of standing up, of taking control, but another part, deep down, wondered if it was enough. Was this really going to change anything? Would one act of defiance be enough to shift the balance of power? Wasn't he still just one person in a city full of people who didn't care about him? The weight of those questions settled heavily on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line, one that would lead to something bigger, and perhaps more dangerous. Moisseau. On the fourth day after the confrontation, Jamal was sitting in his room, staring out of his window, lost in thought. The neighborhood was quiet, the usual hum of traffic muted in the distance. But Jamal wasn't focused on the world outside. He was focused on the knowledge that Officer Davis wasn't going to forget what happened. He would make sure of that. There was a sharp knock on the door, and Jamal turned to see his mother standing in the doorway. She looked different today, tired, worried, but there was a calm in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Jamal," she said, stepping into the room, "we need to talk." He nodded, his stomach dropping at the tone of her voice. Something was wrong. Something bigger than just the cat. "I heard from the neighbors," she continued, her voice heavy with concern. "The word's spreading about what happened with Davis. People are talking, and I just heard that he's going to make sure you pay for what you did." Jamal's pulse quickened. He had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. Officer Davis wasn't going to let this go. Jamal wasn't just some kid who could get away with challenging him. No. He had made it personal, and Jamal knew, deep in his gut, that Davis would do whatever it took to destroy him. "I don't care," Jamal said, his voice quiet but firm. "He can't keep pushing us around. I won't let him." His mother sighed, sitting beside him on the bed. "I know, but you have to be careful, Jamal. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about what happens to people like us when we stand up. You've seen it before. People like him. People who think they're better than us. They won't stop until they break you. Until they break us." Jamal looked at her, his mind racing. He had been living in a world where people like Officer Davis could do whatever they wanted without fear of consequence. And for the first time, he had pushed back. But now, the consequences were coming, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face them. "Do you think I should have backed down?" Jamal asked, his voice small, uncertain. His mother looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pride. "No. I think you did the right thing, but now we have to fight. We have to make sure this doesn't just stay in this house. We have to make sure everyone knows that we're not just going to sit back and let them do whatever they want." Jamal nodded, feeling a surge of determination rise within him. He wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever again. Later that day, Jamal took a walk around the neighborhood, the cool evening air wrapping around him like a quiet reminder of what was at stake. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of conversation drowned out by the tension in the air. As he turned the corner, he saw a group of people standing in front of his house. Their faces were filled with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, and when they saw him approach, they fell silent. "You're the one who stood up to Davis, right?" a man in the crowd asked, his voice unsure. Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. "Yeah, I did. You did what none of us had the guts to do," another person said, his voice tinged with respect. "But be careful. That man's got power. You don't know what he's capable of." Jamal felt the fear creeping up inside him, but he pushed it down. He had done what he had to do. He had made the first move, and now he wasn't going to let anyone stop him. "I'm not afraid," Jamal said, his voice steady, "and neither should any of you be." The crowd shifted, some nodding in agreement, others still unsure. But the seed had been planted. Jamal wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for all of them. And the storm was only just beginning. The tension in the air grew thicker with every passing day. Jamal could feel it, like a storm gathering on the horizon, drawing closer with each step he took. The confrontation with Officer Davis had ignited something inside him, something raw and powerful, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that Jamal wasn't sure he was ready for. At first, the aftermath of the incident seemed like it would just fade away. It was the kind of thing that could be easily swept under the rug in a town where power and privilege held sway over justice. But Jamal knew better now. What had happened was no small thing. It wasn't just about his cat anymore. It was about everything. The systematic racism, the abuse of power, and the silent complicity of a world that had allowed people like Officer Davis to treat Jamal and his community as if they were less than human. That night, as Jamal lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his thoughts churned. His mother's words echoed in his mind, "You have to fight." But what did that really mean? Could one act of defiance truly change anything? Or was he just setting himself up for failure? The next day, things took a turn he hadn't expected. As Jamal wheeled himself down the street to his usual hangout spot, he noticed the whispers. They weren't just behind his back anymore. People were talking openly. And it wasn't just the neighbors. There were more police cars driving through his neighborhood than he'd ever seen before. Officers with their cold, judgmental eyes watching, their presence like a shadow that had fallen over the entire block. The message was clear. Jamal had made a mistake by standing up to Officer Davis. Now, the community would suffer the consequences. As Jamal turned the corner toward the small convenience store where he liked to grab a drink, he was met by the familiar sneer of a group of men hanging out on the sidewalk. These were the same men who had always treated him like a ghost, like someone they could ignore or make fun of at will. But today was different. Today, Jamal wasn't afraid. He couldn't be. "Look at this," one of them said, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a rough, hardened face. "The crippled kid thinks he's tough now. What, you're going to go to war with the cops, boy?" Jamal didn't flinch. He rolled up closer to them, the wheels of his chair scraping against the pavement. He could feel their eyes on him, could feel their disdain dripping like venom from their words, but he refused to let it get to him. Not today. Not anymore. "I'm not afraid of you," Jamal said, his voice steady, though the anger inside him was starting to boil. "And I'm not afraid of Davis either. He doesn't get to treat me like that anymore." The man laughed, a hollow sound that made Jamal's stomach twist. "You really think that's going to make a difference? You think you're the only one that feels that way? You think your little tantrum's going to change anything around here?" Jamal clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it for everyone who's been treated like dirt. You think I'm the only one who's tired of it?" The laughter died in the man's throat. He didn't have a response. No one did. Because Jamal was right. It wasn't just him. The entire community had been oppressed for far too long. And now, someone was standing up. But before anyone could say anything else, the sound of a car pulling up cut through the tense silence. Jamal's heart sank as he recognized the police cruiser. His blood ran cold. He had hoped, even just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, the officers would back off. But no. There they were, the same ones who had watched from the sidelines for years, only now they had come to make their presence known. Officer Davis stepped out of the car, his eyes immediately locking onto Jamal. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry either. He just looked smug, the smugness that came from knowing he had the power, from knowing he could get away with whatever he wanted. Well, Officer Davis said, his voice dripping with contempt as he surveyed the group of men standing around Jamal. What's this? The crippled kid thinks he's got something to say. Jamal didn't back down. No, I don't just think I have something to say, he retorted, his voice strong. I'm saying it, and if you don't like it, that's your problem. The officer took a few steps closer, his boots clicking on the pavement, a predatory gleam in his eye. You should watch your tone, boy. You really want to keep talking like that? Jamal felt the heat rise in his chest. He had heard these words too many times before. Boy, cripple, weak. The same insults, the same treatment. He had spent his entire life feeling like a lesser person, simply because of who he was. But not anymore. Not today. Yeah, I do, Jamal said, his voice steady, his eyes meeting Davis's without fear. Because I'm not a boy anymore, and you don't get to tell me who I am. Officer Davis's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer, looming over Jamal. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to someone challenging him. The officer's eyes darted to the men around Jamal, then back to him, assessing, weighing his options. You're making a big mistake, kid, Officer Davis said, his voice low, almost a growl. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone. The whole damn neighborhood's going to feel the consequences of your little stunt. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't look away. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let fear control him anymore, not with everything at stake. You think you scare me, Jamal said, his voice rising. You think I'm the only one who's tired of being treated like trash. You think you can make me feel small forever. Not anymore. I'm done. The officer reached for his belt, and for a moment, Jamal's stomach dropped, thinking the officer was about to pull out a weapon. But instead, Davis just shook his head, a twisted smile creeping onto his lips. You think this is over? Davis sneered. You think you can win this fight? We make the rules here, kid. And you'll never be anything more than a joke. And with that, the officer turned and headed back toward his car, leaving Jamal alone in the street, his heart still racing. For a moment, the world seemed to go still. The men who had been watching Jamal seemed to shrink back, unsure of what to do next. The air was thick with tension, but Jamal wasn't looking at them. He was watching Officer Davis walk away, feeling a mixture of fury and defiance bubbling up inside him. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later that evening, after the confrontation had ended, Jamal sat on the porch again, the cool breeze offering no relief from the turmoil inside him. His mother was inside, doing her best to act like everything was normal, but Jamal could feel the weight of her worry pressing down on them both. They both knew this wasn't the end. The officer would be back. He would come for them, for Jamal, and the whole neighborhood would feel the consequences. Jamal ran his fingers over the wheels of his chair, his mind swirling. He had fought back. He had stood up to Davis, but now he was starting to realize just how deep the problem ran. It wasn't just one officer. It wasn't just about a single act of cruelty. This was bigger. This was about the system. The system that had been built to keep people like Jamal in their place. But Jamal wasn't going to let that stop him. He wasn't going to be silenced. Not now. Not ever again. This was just the beginning. Jamal clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just going to survive. He was going to make them listen. He was going to make them change. And he would start by making sure Officer Davis never forgot what had happened today. The days that followed the confrontation with Officer Davis were heavy with the weight of unspoken things. Jamal could feel the shift in the air, the palpable tension that gripped his community. Everyone knew something was coming, but no one was sure what it would look like. The officer had left, but his shadow remained, hovering over Jamal like a threat waiting to be fulfilled. Jamal spent those days wrestling with the storm inside him. He had made his stand, taken that first step toward breaking the silence that had kept him small for so long. But now he was left with the consequences. Officer Davis wouldn't let this go. He wouldn't stop. He had made that clear. What Jamal didn't expect, however, was the reaction from the people around him. It wasn't just fear that bubbled up, not just the cold silence of uncertainty. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. Resentment. There was a quiet resentment in the eyes of those who had once ignored him, those who had once dismissed him as just another black boy in a wheelchair. Now they were watching him, waiting to see what would come next. He had no idea that standing up to the officer would cause a ripple, a wave that would crash through the walls of the neighborhood and beyond. But that's exactly what was happening. His defiance had opened a door, one that was letting the light into a place that had long been darkened by fear and submission. Jamal wheeled himself down the street one afternoon, feeling the weight of the world pressing on his chest. The usual hum of life in the neighborhood seemed muffled, like it was all happening behind a glass wall. He had expected things to be quiet, at least for a while, but the whispers were louder than ever. People passed by with averted eyes, some offering him fleeting glances of respect, others veiled with judgment. The dynamic had changed. The officer's power over Jamal had been shattered, but that didn't mean the world was ready to change with it. As Jamal reached the corner store, he noticed a group of local men standing together on the sidewalk, talking in low voices. The older ones in the group often exchanged words with Jamal's mother, words of sympathy, of shared struggles, of a world that had always kept them in their place. But today, the atmosphere was different. They were talking in hushed tones, eyes darting nervously toward Jamal as he approached. He felt it, a subtle unease, a hesitance. He wheeled closer, drawing the attention of one of the men, who straightened up from where he stood against the wall. His name was Elijah, a guy Jamal had known his whole life. Elijah had always been someone who kept his distance from Jamal, who never openly showed his disdain, but made sure to remind him of his place through quiet gestures or veiled comments. Elijah gave Jamal a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You did something big, Jamal," he said slowly. "You stood up to him." Jamal didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure if Elijah was congratulating him or warning him. "Yeah," Jamal finally said, his voice steady. "But it's not over." Elijah nodded, though his gaze dropped for a moment, as if weighing something heavy. He looked back at Jamal, his eyes filled with an emotion Jamal couldn't place. "You don't get it, do you? The things you're doing, the things you're saying, they're gonna come for you. And when they do, it won't be just you they come for. It'll be everyone who's ever tried to speak up, to stand out. You can't just poke a hornet's nest and expect nothing to happen." Jamal frowned. "What are you talking about? I'm not letting them walk all over me anymore." "You think you're the first to stand up to Davis?" Elijah's voice was quieter now, his tone almost bitter. "You think you're the first one to think they can change things just by getting loud? We've all been there, kid. We've all tried to make them listen. But they don't care. They never do." Jamal felt his chest tighten. "I'm not the same as all those other people," he said, his voice rising. "I'm not going to sit back and let them keep treating me like dirt." Elijah's gaze hardened. "I know you think you're different, but you're not. They'll break you. They'll break us all. They always do." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You think they'll leave you alone after this? Think again." The weight of Elijah's words hit Jamal hard. He wasn't wrong. The officers, the system, they were always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike back, to remind Jamal and others like him who really had the power. Jamal's defiance, as liberating as it felt, had opened a door that led to a much darker place, and he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't pretend that everything would be fine, because he stood up once. He knew that standing up meant making a target of himself. But Jamal wasn't willing to back down. Not anymore. He couldn't. There was too much at stake. Later that evening, as Jamal sat on the porch of his house, his mind racing, he saw Officer Davis's car pull up again. This time, it wasn't just a casual pass-by. The officer parked directly in front of Jamal's house, his cruiser's lights flashing, bathing the street in an eerie red glow. Jamal's mother stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, but Jamal could see the tension in her posture. She had seen it too. The officer was coming for him, coming for his family. Jamal's hands gripped the wheels of his chair, but he didn't move. He couldn't show weakness. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. He wasn't just going to let this man intimidate him. He had already faced that fear. The officer stepped out of the car, his uniform tight and sharp, the same arrogant look on his face that Jamal had come to loathe. But this time, there was something different about the way Davis moved. He wasn't here for the usual quiet harassment. He was here to make a statement. Jamal could feel it. "Jamal," Officer Davis called, his voice low, almost too casual, as if this were just another ordinary day for him. "We need to talk." Jamal didn't respond right away. He stayed quiet, his eyes locked on the officer, refusing to show any sign of fear. The officer took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jamal, clearly irritated by his silence. "You really think you can just make a scene like that and get away with it?" Davis asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Jamal swallowed, his throat dry, but he stood his ground. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. The officer laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. It was cold, full of disdain. "Afraid? This isn't about fear. This is about understanding where you fit in the world. And you, boy, don't fit." For a split second, Jamal's heart skipped a beat. The words stung, but he didn't let them show. He knew that Davis was trying to provoke him, trying to make him lose control, and he wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. "This neighborhood," Officer Davis continued, taking another step closer, "isn't for people like you. You're just a nuisance, and I'm not going to let you forget that." Jamal could feel the heat of the officer's words, but he also felt the storm inside him grow. He wasn't a nuisance. He wasn't just some problem to be erased. He was a person. He was a voice that would be heard. "Maybe you're the problem," Jamal shot back, his voice cold, his hands tight on his chair. "Maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The officer froze, his jaw tightening as he took a step back. Jamal could see the anger building in Davis's eyes. For a moment, it seemed like the officer was about to snap, but instead, he looked over at Jamal's mother, who was still standing in the doorway, her face hardening as she watched the scene unfold. "You should keep your son in line," Officer Davis sneered. "If you don't, I'll be forced to take further action." Jamal's mother didn't flinch. "You have no right to treat my son like this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "None." Officer Davis stared at her for a moment, the tension in the air palpable, before turning on his heel and storming back to his car. "This isn't over, kid," he called over his shoulder. "You'll see." As the car sped away, Jamal sat there, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had stood up. He had fought back. But the reality of what lay ahead started to sink in. This wasn't just about him. It was about the entire community. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for the war that was coming. But one thing was clear. He couldn't back down. He wouldn't. Not now. The battle had only just begun, and Jamal was ready to face it, no matter the cost. The days following Officer Davis's threat felt like they were slipping through Jamal's fingers, like sand in the wind. The quiet hum of the neighborhood, the normalcy he had once taken for granted, was replaced with an undercurrent of fear. It wasn't just about him anymore. He had woken something, stirred a hornet's nest, and now the world around him felt different, more dangerous, more oppressive. Jamal sat on the porch, staring out at the street as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The once familiar sounds of children playing, cars passing by, and the occasional shout from the corner store were absent. Instead, everything felt still, like the calm before a storm. The air was thick with uncertainty, and the weight of it pressed heavily on Jamal's chest. He could feel it. The tension, the whispering, people watching him. The looks weren't just of curiosity anymore. They were full of judgment. The way the officers patrolled the neighborhood had changed. There were more patrol cars, more eyes on the people who lived here, more signs that the power dynamics were shifting in a way that didn't favor him or anyone like him. Jamal's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. His mother appeared at the door, her face drawn with concern. She had seen it too, the slow descent into a place where people like them had no control, no voice, no place. She had been through it all before. The whispers, the threats, the endless humiliation of being black and poor in a world that had never cared. Jamal could see the weight in her eyes. It was the same look she had when he was younger, the one that said, "I can protect you, but I can't protect us all." "Jamal," she said, her voice steady but tinged with worry. "You need to be careful. The officers are watching you now. They're watching all of us." Jamal didn't respond at first. He had heard it all before. The fear, the warnings, the stay-in-your-place messages that came from people who didn't want to see change, didn't want to risk upsetting the status quo. But something inside Jamal had snapped. He wasn't going to just sit back anymore. Not when he had seen the cruelty and the power that had been allowed to fester for so long. Not when his cat, his only friend, the one thing that had given him comfort, had been murdered in cold blood by Officer Davis, simply because Jamal had dared to exist in the way he was born. "I can't just let it go, Mom," Jamal finally said, his voice low but firm. "I can't just let him win. I can't go back to being the kid everyone ignores, the kid they push around. It's not right." His mother stood there for a moment, her gaze hardening. She understood. She had fought her entire life too, but there was a part of her that still wanted to protect him, that still wanted to shield him from the harshness of the world, a world that had already shown him how quickly it could break someone like him. "I know," she whispered, her eyes softening. "But I'm scared, Jamal. I'm scared for you, for us." Jamal nodded, his chest tight. The fear wasn't just hers, it was his too. But the rage that had built up inside him couldn't be ignored. He had to do something. He had to make them see him, see his community. He wasn't just going to disappear into the background again. The next day, Jamal went out again, pushing himself through the streets in his chair. This time, he wasn't just going to the corner store. This time, he was going to make sure everyone saw him. He wasn't going to let the stares and the whispers define him. As he rolled down the sidewalk, he could feel the eyes on him, the people glancing at him as he passed. Some looked away quickly, others just stared, as if trying to figure out what he was doing. Jamal didn't look back. He kept moving, pushing forward through the neighborhood that had always been a prison of sorts for him. As he reached the small park at the corner, Jamal saw a familiar face. It was Elijah, the man who had warned him about the consequences of challenging Davis. The same man who had told him that standing up would only lead to pain. But Elijah wasn't the only one standing there. A small group of people were gathered around, some older, some younger, all from the community. They were watching Jamal, waiting for him to make his move, waiting for him to lead. Jamal stopped in front of them, his hands steady on the wheels of his chair. The tension was thick in the air. It was the first time he had seen this many people from the neighborhood stand together like this. Normally, there was quiet resistance, hushed conversations behind closed doors, people grumbling about the unfairness of it all, but never acting on it. Today, Jamal knew that something had shifted. Today, they were ready to follow. "You've made a mess, you know that," Elijah said, his voice low, but it carried across the group. There was no anger in his words, just the truth. "Davis isn't going to let this slide. You've pissed off a lot of people, and they're not going to forget." Jamal met his gaze, his eyes burning with determination. "I don't care if they remember me. I don't care if they want to forget. I'm not going to stay quiet, not anymore." The people around him exchanged glances, some of them unsure, others nodding slowly. There was a murmur among the crowd, a shared feeling of recognition, a feeling that had been buried for too long. One of the women, a tall, older woman with short grey hair and a face weathered by years of struggle, stepped forward. "You're right, Jamal. We can't let this go. But we can't just stand here either. We have to do something. We have to show them that we won't be pushed down anymore." Her words hit Jamal like a jolt of electricity. We have to show them. For the first time, the realization that the entire community was behind him, that they were ready to fight with him, made the fear that had been building in his chest subside, just for a moment. The storm inside him calmed, and he felt something else, something more powerful than fear. It was a sense of purpose. "We'll do more than show them," Jamal said, his voice strong, unwavering. "We'll make them listen. We'll make them regret ever thinking they could walk all over us." Elijah looked at him, his expression still uncertain, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps respect, behind his eyes. "You sure about that, kid? You're not the only one who'll pay the price for this. We all will." Jamal's jaw clenched. "I know. But if we don't do something now, we'll never be heard. They'll keep doing this. They'll keep treating us like we don't matter. I'm not going to let them forget that we do." The group stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Jamal's words sinking in. One by one, they began to nod, their shoulders straightening, their eyes sharpening. Jamal wasn't alone in this fight anymore. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. The small park, usually so quiet and empty, was filled with the sound of resolve. The people who had always been silent, the ones who had feared the repercussions of standing up, now stood together, their strength rising in a collective wave. They were ready to take the first steps. Jamal could feel it, the energy building, the power of unity. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his community, for the people who had never had a voice, for the ones who had been silenced for too long. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the fight was far from over, but he also knew that he wasn't going to back down. They all turned to face the road ahead, the road where Officer Davis and the system that supported him were waiting, the road where the fight for justice was just beginning. Jamal rolled forward, his heart beating with the pulse of a movement that was no longer just his. He wasn't alone, not anymore. And this time, they were ready. The storm had only just begun, and Jamal was at its center. But for the first time, he felt the strength of the people beside him. This was no longer a battle of one. It was a battle for everyone who had been made to feel small, forgotten, invisible, and they were ready to fight. Together. And as Jamal pushed forward, the weight of his past, the weight of the years of suffering, seemed a little lighter. Because now he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something greater, for change, for justice, and nothing would stop him from seeing it through. The following days felt like a slow unraveling, each hour stretching out longer than the last. Jamal sat at his kitchen table, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The people in his community were watching, waiting. They were eager to fight, but they were also afraid. Jamal could see it in their eyes, hear it in the quiet conversations when they thought no one was listening. The fear was everywhere, permeating everything. But so was something else. Hope. The kind of hope that comes with the belief that they could make a difference. But Jamal knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He wasn't just up against Officer Davis anymore. It was bigger than that now. It was about the entire system, one that had been built on the oppression of people like him, people who were seen as less, as expendable, as invisible. And the fear was real. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed aside, trampled underfoot by the powers that be. He knew the stakes were high. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his community, for every person who had been silenced, for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't matter. And as much as the fear gnawed at him, something else drove him. Something deeper. A burning need to make sure that what had happened to him, what had happened to so many others, was never ignored again. The news of his confrontation with Officer Davis had spread like wildfire. At first, it was just the whispers in the streets, the knowing glances, the hushed voices. But soon, it became something bigger. More people were talking. More people were organizing. What Jamal had done, what he had dared to do, had inspired something in his neighborhood. It had sparked a fire, one that couldn't be easily extinguished. But with that fire came danger. Jamal could feel it in his bones. Officer Davis wasn't going to forget about him, and neither was the rest of the system. They were going to make sure he paid for what he had done. and they would make everyone who stood with him pay too. It was late one afternoon when Jamal received the first real sign that things were escalating. He had just returned home from the community center, where he had spent hours speaking with the local activists about organizing a march, about making their voices heard. He was exhausted but determined. His mind was already planning the next steps, the rallies, the petitions, the pressure they needed to apply on the city officials to make sure Officer Davis was held accountable. But as he wheeled himself up the sidewalk toward his front door, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A police car was parked in front of his house. Jamal froze. The cop sitting inside the car had the same look as the one that had harassed him before, the same cold, dismissive look that always made him feel small, made him feel like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. But this time, it wasn't just any officer. This was a different man. He had seen him around the neighborhood before. Officer Harding. A taller, more muscular cop with an air of superiority that seemed to ooze from every pore. Jamal's pulse quickened as he wheeled himself closer. The officer hadn't noticed him yet, but Jamal knew. He knew that this was no coincidence. The police had come for him. They were watching him, waiting for him to slip up, waiting for him to make one wrong move so they could use it as an excuse to bring him down. As he reached the bottom step of his porch, Officer Harding stepped out of the car, his boots clinking against the pavement. He looked at Jamal, his face hard and unwelcoming. But there was something else in his eyes, something calculating, something that made Jamal feel like a target, like a prisoner. "Jamal," Officer Harding said, his voice low, almost predatory. "Got a minute?" Jamal's breath caught in his throat. The officer's tone was the same as Davis's. It was the tone of someone who had power, who knew that no matter what they did, they would always get away with it. "What do you want?" Jamal asked, his voice steady, but he could feel the fear creeping in. "Oh, nothing," Harding said with a chuckle. "Just thought I'd stop by and remind you to watch your step. You wouldn't want to do something stupid, would you? You don't want to end up like the last kid who thought he could take on the police, do you?" Jamal's stomach tightened at the officer's words. It was a veiled threat, but Jamal knew exactly what it meant. The officer was reminding him that he had the power, that if Jamal kept pushing, if he kept fighting back, they would crush him. And they wouldn't just crush him, they would crush everyone around him, everyone who dared to support him, everyone who had ever looked at him and seen a person, not just a problem to be dealt with. But Jamal didn't flinch. Not this time. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions. He wasn't going to let them push him back into the corner where he had spent so much of his life. "You don't scare me," Jamal said, his voice unwavering. "I've had enough. You don't get to treat me or anyone in this neighborhood like we're invisible." Harding's eyes narrowed, and his smile twisted into something far darker. "You really think you're in a position to make demands?" he sneered. "You think you can keep up this little fight of yours and not face the consequences? You're just a kid in a chair, a cripple." The word hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the first time he had heard it, but it was the first time it had come from someone who had the power to hurt him. Someone who had been taught their entire life that people like Jamal were less, that they didn't matter. "You're nothing but a problem waiting to be dealt with," Officer Harding said, his voice cold, his words like knives. Jamal's hands tightened around the armrests of his chair, his body shaking with the urge to act, to do something that would show them that he wasn't just going to sit back and take it anymore. His heart raced in his chest, but he held himself together. He had a choice now, a choice to either let them tear him down or stand his ground. "I'm not a problem," Jamal said, his voice steady and firm, though his hands shook with the force of his own anger. "I'm a person, and I matter." The officer's eyes flared with fury, but he didn't move. Instead, he turned on his heel and stormed back to his car, slamming the door shut behind him. Jamal watched him go, but the words lingered in his mind. He wasn't the first to stand up to the police, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But the price of defiance was never small. That night, Jamal lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Officer Harding's words still echoed in his mind, his voice dripping with disdain. But more than that, it was the threat hanging in the air. The fear. The knowledge that the officers, the system, everyone who had power, would stop at nothing to break him, to silence him, to make sure that no one like him ever dared to stand up again. But Jamal wasn't going to stop. He couldn't. Not after everything he had been through. Not after everything his family had been through. He had taken that first step, and there was no turning back. There were too many lives at stake now. Too many people who had been silenced for too long. The next morning, as Jamal sat at the kitchen table, his mother came in, her face drawn with worry. She had heard about the officer's visit, and she knew that this was only the beginning. She had spent her whole life trying to protect him, trying to shield him from the harshness of the world. But Jamal wasn't just her son anymore. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world, and he wasn't going to let them make him invisible again. "Jamal," she said softly, sitting down across from him. "I'm scared. I'm scared for you. For us." Jamal looked at her, his heart aching. "I know, Mom, but I'm not going to stop. I can't. This fight, it's not just for me. It's for everyone who's been made to feel like we don't matter, like we're nothing." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I know, but just remember, you can't fight them alone. You need to be careful." Jamal reached across the table and took her hand, his voice steady, filled with a strength he didn't know he had. "I'm not alone, Mom. Not anymore." And as he looked out the window, watching the neighborhood that had always felt so suffocating, something inside him shifted. The fight was far from over. It was just beginning. But this time, Jamal wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. He was fighting for justice, for change, and no one, no officer, no system would stop him. The following weeks were nothing short of relentless. Jamal could feel the mounting pressure, like a suffocating cloud hanging over him. Each passing day bringing new challenges, new threats. His act of defiance had set something in motion, something he wasn't sure he could control. The tension was palpable. Everyone in the community was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. But Jamal's every step was being followed by those who sought to make him pay for daring to challenge the status quo. Officer Davis was no longer just an isolated figure of intimidation in Jamal's life. He had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. The racism, the prejudice, the unyielding sense of entitlement that came from being part of a structure built to oppress. Davis and the officers that followed him were part of a machine that had been running for far too long, crushing anyone who dared to stand in its way. Jamal had never felt this kind of weight before. This constant pressure to remain strong, to keep fighting, when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. His neighborhood was tense, the streets quieter than usual, with most people staying inside, fearful of what would happen next. The officers' threats were more than just words. They had become a chilling promise. But Jamal wasn't backing down. He couldn't. The memory of his cat, the one thing in the world that had truly loved him, haunted him. The loss was still fresh, but so was the rage that had fueled his stand against Officer Davis. He had made a promise to himself that he wouldn't stop, no matter the cost. He would make sure that this moment, this spark of defiance, would lead to something bigger. One afternoon, Jamal was sitting on the porch, his chair positioned just outside the door as he watched the world move around him. It felt like the calm before a storm. Quiet, oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. His mother was inside, cleaning, but Jamal could feel the tension radiating off of her. She knew, just like he did, that things were spiraling. The police had made their presence known in the neighborhood, driving by more frequently, stopping in front of houses for no reason at all. It was a silent threat, one that said, "We are watching you. We are in control." As Jamal sat there, his thoughts racing, he saw a group of teenagers pass by. He recognized them as kids from his school, kids who had grown up alongside him, kids who had watched him from a distance, but never truly acknowledged him. But now, they seemed to be paying attention. The looks were different, curious, expectant. One of the boys, a tall kid named Marcus, hesitated before walking up to Jamal. He was part of the same crowd that had always looked down on Jamal, the group that had quietly made fun of him for his wheelchair and his quiet demeanor. But today, there was something different in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It wasn't mockery. It was something deeper. Something that said maybe, just maybe, Jamal wasn't as invisible as he thought. "Yo, Jamal," Marcus said, his voice surprisingly soft. "We've been hearing about what happened with Davis. People are talking. You know, a lot of folks are saying you did the right thing, but some folks are worried about what's going to happen next. People are scared, man." Jamal looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. Marcus had never been kind to him before, but something in his tone made Jamal pause. "And what are you worried about, Marcus?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "You worried about me? Or about yourself?" Marcus shifted, clearly taken aback. He wasn't used to Jamal speaking to him like that, not with that edge in his voice. "I'm not worried about me, man," Marcus said quickly. "But a lot of people are scared. The cops are everywhere now, and it's like they're waiting for an excuse. You know what I mean?" Jamal's heart tightened. He knew exactly what Marcus meant. But it wasn't just the cops who were the problem. It was everyone who had been too comfortable with the way things were, too comfortable with letting people like Jamal and his family suffer in silence. It was the quiet complicity that had allowed the system to thrive for so long. "They want us to stay quiet," Jamal said, his voice low. "They want us to be scared. But I'm not scared anymore. I can't be." Marcus nodded, but the unease didn't leave his face. "You're brave, man," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I'm telling you, you're not just fighting one guy. You're fighting a whole system. You can't do it alone." Jamal's chest tightened at the words. He knew Marcus was right. He couldn't do it alone. He had never truly been alone. His family, the people in his community, they had always been there. But now, he had to do something more. He had to bring them all together. He had to make sure the fight wasn't just about him. It had to be about everyone who had ever been made to feel less. "I don't have a choice, Marcus," Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. "If I don't do this, then no one will. They'll keep us down. They'll keep making us feel small. And I'm done with that. I'm not going to sit back and let them do it anymore." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, and then, to Jamal's surprise, he nodded. "I get it," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm with you, Jamal. We all are. Just be careful, all right? There's a lot of people out here who don't want things to change. People who'll do whatever it takes to keep things the way they are." Jamal nodded, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. The fight wasn't just against Officer Davis anymore. It was against everything. It was against the world that had allowed people like him to be treated like they didn't matter. The world was big, and Jamal was just one person. But maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. That night, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, his mind swirling. His mother had gone to bed early, exhausted from the weight of everything that was happening. Jamal had become the focal point of something much bigger than himself, and while part of him felt a sense of pride, another part of him was terrified. Terrified of what was coming next. Terrified of what the price of defiance would be. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Jamal froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He knew that knock. It wasn't a friendly one. It wasn't the knock of a neighbor dropping by. It was the knock of someone who wanted to remind him who was in charge. He wheeled toward the door, his mind racing. As he opened it, he was met with the grim face of Officer Harding, the same officer who had visited him before. Behind him, a squad car was parked at the curb, lights flashing. Jamal felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't back away. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. "What do you want?" Jamal asked, his voice steady, but his heart was pounding. Officer Harding stepped forward, his expression cold and unreadable. "We need to talk, Jamal," he said, his voice low. "You've made things difficult. You've put a target on your back, and now we're here to make sure you understand what happens when people like you get too bold." Jamal's fists clenched. He knew what this was. This was intimidation. This was a message. He wasn't just fighting against one officer anymore. He was fighting against the entire system. "I'm not going anywhere," Jamal said, his voice firm. "And I'm not afraid of you." Harding smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You should be," he said quietly. "You'll see soon enough. Things aren't going to go the way you think they will. But go ahead, keep fighting, keep pushing. It'll make it all the more satisfying when we take you down." Jamal didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The officer's words were hollow. He was trying to scare him. But Jamal wasn't scared anymore. The officer turned to leave, his boots clicking on the pavement as he walked away. Jamal closed the door behind him, but he didn't feel relief. He felt something else, something heavier. This wasn't just about him anymore. The fight wasn't just about one person's defiance. It was about a community, a people who had been silenced for too long, a people who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. And now, the entire system was coming for them. Jamal sat down at the kitchen table, his hands shaking, his mind spinning. But deep inside, he knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The war was far from over. It had only just begun. And Jamal was ready to fight. The next few days felt like a blur to Jamal. Each morning, he woke up with a weight on his chest, a constant reminder that his life had changed in ways he had never expected. The neighborhood, once familiar, now felt like an arena where every step he took carried the burden of a community's hopes and fears. The people who had been silent for so long were no longer afraid to speak, but the fear of repercussions hung in the air like a thick fog. Jamal had always known that the world could be a cruel place. He had always known that being disabled and black in a society that valued neither could be a heavy burden to bear. But what he hadn't fully understood, until now, was how deep that cruelty ran. It wasn't just the obvious hatred, the looks of disdain, or the whispers behind his back. It was the systemic weight that crushed everything and everyone in its path. It was the deep-seated belief that people like him didn't matter, that their voices didn't count. And it wasn't just Officer Davis, it was everyone like him. Everyone who had ever made Jamal feel like he didn't belong. Everyone who had ever looked at him with disgust or indifference. The police, the politicians, the people in power, they all saw him and others like him as expendable. And that's what this fight was about. It wasn't just about one officer's cruelty. It was about the system that allowed it to happen. The day after Officer Harding's visit, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Jamal could feel it in the air, a thick heaviness that seemed to cling to everyone. His own family was more subdued than usual, the weight of what was happening pressing down on them all. His mother had always been a source of strength for him, but even she seemed uncertain, unsure of what the next step would be. As Jamal sat in the living room, his eyes focused on the TV but his mind elsewhere. His phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, seeing a message from Elijah. "They're planning something. We need to meet. This is getting worse." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. The message was simple, but the meaning was clear. Things were escalating. The meeting, the rally they had talked about, everything was coming to a head. The police had made it clear that they weren't just watching anymore. They were coming for him. And the community was starting to feel the heat. Jamal quickly typed back. "Where? When?" 7 p.m. Same place. He looked up at his mother, who was busy in the kitchen, her movements slower than usual. She was always a rock, steady and strong, but now Jamal could see the cracks. The fear was there. It was in the way her eyes darted to the window whenever a car drove by, the way she flinched at every knock on the door. Jamal knew she was scared. Scared for him, scared for them both. But he couldn't back down. Not now. "I'm going out," Jamal said, his voice calm but determined. His mother stopped what she was doing and turned to look at him, her face creased with worry. "Jamal, be careful. I don't know what's going to happen, but this is getting dangerous. I've seen this before. You don't want to—" "I have to do this," Jamal interrupted, his voice steady, but the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "If I don't, they'll keep pushing us around. They'll keep doing whatever they want, and I'm not going to let them." His mother's eyes softened, the concern still there but mixed with a flicker of pride. She knew. She knew he couldn't back down. Not anymore. She had seen the fire in him for too long to deny it. "Just be careful," she whispered, walking over to him and placing a hand on his shoulder. "I love you." I know, Mom, Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. I love you too. By the time Jamal arrived at the park, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the streets. The air felt thick, heavy with the tension of the gathering crowd. The people who had come were quiet at first, a sense of unease hanging over them all. Some had their heads down, others were talking in hushed voices, but all of them were here for the same reason, to stand up. Elijah was already there, standing near the far side of the park, his eyes scanning the crowd. He looked up when he saw Jamal and walked over to him, his expression serious. Glad you made it, Elijah said, his voice low. It's time. You ready? Jamal looked around, his gaze settling on the people who had gathered. There were young people, old people, men and women, all of them united by the same anger, the same sense of injustice. It was a small crowd, but they were strong, and that was all that mattered. I'm ready, Jamal said, his voice steady. Let's do this. Elijah nodded, and without another word, he stepped forward, addressing the group. Listen up, everyone, he called, his voice carrying across the park. We've all been pushed to the edge. They've treated us like we don't matter, like we're nothing. But we're done being silent. We're done being invisible. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The cops want to scare us, Elijah continued, his eyes flashing with anger. They want to make us afraid of standing up, but we're not afraid, not anymore. We're here, and we're taking back our voices. Jamal could feel the energy in the crowd shift. They were ready. They weren't just following him. They were following their own anger, their own desire to be seen, to be heard. We have to show them that we're not going anywhere, Elijah said, his voice rising. This isn't just about Jamal. This is about all of us. This is about every single person who has ever been treated like dirt, like they don't matter. The crowd began to cheer, their voices rising in a chorus of agreement. Jamal's heart swelled with pride. This wasn't just his fight anymore. This was everyone's fight. As the crowd began to move, Jamal wheeled himself to the front, leading them through the streets, the sounds of their voices echoing off the buildings. They marched toward the police station, their steps steady and resolute. The streets that had always felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who didn't care about them, were now theirs. They were taking them back, one step at a time. But the closer they got to the station, the more Jamal could feel the tension rising. The streets that had been quiet just a few hours ago now felt charged, like something was about to explode. Police officers were lining the streets, standing in formation, their eyes cold and hostile. Jamal could feel their gaze on him, feel the judgment, the hatred. And then, just as they reached the entrance to the station, the officers stepped forward, their hands resting on their weapons. You need to turn around, one of the officers said, his voice deep and unwavering. This is illegal. You don't have permission to protest here. Jamal stopped, his heart pounding. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. But he knew this moment would change everything. This was the point of no return. We don't need your permission, Jamal said, his voice rising over the crowd. We're not going anywhere. This is our street. This is our fight. You don't get to tell us to go back to our corners. We're here, and we're going to be heard. The officer sneered, his eyes narrowing. You really think you can do this? You think you can stand here and cause trouble without consequences? Jamal's hands gripped the wheels of his chair tightly. This was it. This was the moment where everything would change. He could feel the eyes of the officers on him, could feel the hate in their gaze. But he wasn't backing down. You've been hurting us for too long, Jamal said, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion. You've been making us feel like we don't matter, like we're invisible. But we're done with that. We matter. The officer took a step closer, his jaw clenched. You have no idea what you're getting into, he growled. We'll make you regret this. Jamal's heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't look away. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. And as the officer raised his hand, signaling for backup, Jamal knew this was just the beginning. This was the moment where they would either crush them or they would make history. The fight was no longer just for survival. It was for their dignity, for their humanity. And they were not backing down. Jamal felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The officers weren't just standing there. They were preparing for something much more violent. The sound of sirens pierced the air, getting louder and louder. Backup was on the way. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days following the march felt like the world was holding its breath. The community, once quiet and subdued under the oppressive weight of fear, was now buzzing with energy. Jamal could feel the shift. People were starting to believe that change was possible. They had stood together, marched together, and for the first time, they had been heard. But Jamal also knew that the victory had come at a price, and the real battle was just beginning. Officer Davis and the others in his department hadn't forgotten what had happened. The streets had become an open battleground, not for physical confrontation, but for control. Every glance, every word, every subtle shift in behavior was a reminder that this was not just about one man's cruelty. It was about a system that had been built to hold people down, to suppress their voices and their power. But Jamal was determined not to let that system silence him. He had spent years of his life trying to fit in, trying to be invisible, trying to stay out of the way of the people who would never accept him. But no more would he be a quiet observer of his own life. Now he was taking control, and that frightened the people who had always been in charge. It had been a week since the march, and Jamal hadn't seen much of his friends. The tension in the air had only grown stronger. The police presence in the neighborhood was more noticeable than ever. They weren't just patrolling, they were watching, eyes cold, calculating. Every move Jamal made was under scrutiny. He could feel the heavy weight of the system bearing down on him, but he refused to give in. One evening, Jamal was sitting at his kitchen table, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping against the wood, when his mother walked in, a troubled look on her face. She was always strong, always doing her best to keep things together. But lately, the worry lines in her face had deepened. The world outside was closing in, and Jamal could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of what could happen to him, to their family. "Jamal," she said softly, her voice thick with concern, "you need to be careful. I heard from Mrs. Thompson down the street. She said that Davis and his crew have been talking, and they're looking for a way to make an example out of you. They're not going to let this go." Jamal looked up at her, his gaze steady. He could feel her concern, but he knew there was no going back. "I know, Mum, but I'm not going to hide anymore. I'm not going to sit by and let them treat us like this." His mother sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know you're angry, baby, but we can't fight this alone. You're putting yourself and everyone around you in danger. What if they come after us next? What if they hurt someone else because of what you did?" Jamal felt the familiar pang of guilt in his chest, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce determination. "I can't let them control us anymore. I can't let them make us afraid of living our lives. I'm done being afraid." His mother walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm but heavy with the weight of her worries. "Just be careful. Promise me you'll think about the consequences before you act. I don't want to lose you." Jamal swallowed the lump in his throat. He didn't want to lose himself either, but he had already crossed the line. He had made his stand, and now there was no turning back. "I promise," he said, though deep down, he knew that no matter what he said, nothing would stop him from continuing this fight. The next day, as Jamal wheeled himself through the neighborhood, he noticed something unsettling. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual buzz of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. The faces that had once greeted him with friendly nods now avoided his gaze, eyes darting away as if they were afraid to make eye contact. Jamal could feel the weight of their judgment. The air felt thick with something unspoken, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. As he approached the corner store, he saw a group of young men standing near the entrance, their faces hard and unsmiling. They were watching him, but it wasn't with the curiosity or sympathy he had hoped for. No, it was something else, something darker. It was the look of people who were uncertain, people who were afraid, people who had been told to be wary of him, to stay away from the trouble he had caused. Jamal stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair, waiting to see if anyone would acknowledge him. For a moment, there was just silence. Then, one of the men, a guy Jamal had known since childhood, stepped forward. His name was Trey, and they had never exactly been friends. But Trey had never been openly hostile either. They had always exchanged words in passing, casual pleasantries. But now, as Trey looked at him, there was something different in his eyes. The usual indifference was gone. Instead, there was a mixture of confusion and fear. "You're still pushing this, huh?" Trey said, his voice low. "You think marching in the streets is going to change anything?" Jamal stared at him, feeling the anger begin to bubble in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rising frustration. "You don't think it'll make a difference? You don't think it's worth fighting for?" Trey looked down at the ground for a moment, almost as if he was searching for the right words. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost apologetic. "I don't know, man. I don't know if it's worth it. The cops, the system, it's been like this forever. Ain't nothing gonna change. You're just asking for trouble, man." Jamal's stomach twisted at his words. He had heard this before. The defeat, the resignation that came from people who had been beaten down by the world so many times that they had given up. But Jamal couldn't accept that. Not now. Not when things were finally changing. "I can't just sit back and let them keep doing this," Jamal said, his voice firm. "I can't keep living in a world that treats me like I don't matter, that treats people like me like we don't matter. I won't stand for it anymore." Trey sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Man, I get it. I do. But it's not that simple. You can't just take on the whole world. You think they'll let you win? You think they'll let us win?" Jamal's heart ached at the doubt in Trey's voice. It was the same doubt he had carried with him for years, the same feeling of hopelessness that had kept him silent for so long. But now, Jamal wasn't willing to let that doubt control him. He wasn't willing to let it control the people around him. "You're right. It's not simple," Jamal said, his voice quiet. "But I'd rather fight than just sit back and let them win. And I'm not the only one who feels this way. We've been quiet for too long. We've let them push us around for too long. But not anymore. Not me. Not us." Trey stood there for a long moment, his eyes searching Jamal's face. Finally, he nodded, though it was a reluctant, uncertain gesture. "I hope you're right," he muttered, stepping back into the group. Jamal wheeled himself away, his mind racing. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know what the consequences of his actions would be. But he knew one thing. He couldn't stop. He couldn't let the system continue to crush him, to crush the people around him, to crush everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't matter. The following week, things took a turn. It wasn't just the police. It wasn't just the officers who had begun to make their presence known in the neighborhood. It was the people in power, the ones who could control the narrative, who could control the outcome of Jamal's fight. The city council called for a special meeting. They said it was about community safety and restoring order. But Jamal knew what it really meant. It meant they were coming for him, coming for the movement, coming for the people who had dared to stand up and demand change. Jamal attended the meeting with his mother and a few other people from the neighborhood. The air inside the council room was thick with tension. The council members sat on their high chairs, their eyes cold and disinterested, as the crowd gathered before them. There was no real intent to listen, no real intent to change anything. This was just a formality, a way to quiet the noise that had begun to rise from the streets. When it was Jamal's turn to speak, he wheeled up to the podium, his heart racing in his chest. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He wasn't just speaking for the people who had shown up tonight. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't matter. "My name is Jamal," he said, his voice strong, though his hands trembled slightly on the chair's armrests. "And I'm here because I'm tired of being treated like I don't exist. I'm here because we've had enough. We've had enough of the hate, the racism, the injustice. We've had enough of the people who think they can push us around because of the color of our skin, because of our disability. We matter, and we will not be silenced." The room was silent. The council members exchanged glances, but no one spoke. The tension in the room was unbearable. Jamal could feel the weight of it pressing on him, but he refused to back down. This was his moment. This was his chance to make sure that no one else would ever have to live like this again. "We will not be forgotten," he continued. The days leading up to the final confrontation were the hardest Jamal had ever endured. The air felt thick with hostility, every look, every whisper laden with judgment and fear. Jamal's actions had not only stirred up the officers and the people in power, but had shaken the very foundations of the system that kept everyone like him in their place. And now, standing at the edge of a precipice, he realized that there was no turning back. He had done it. He had taken a stand. But now, the consequences were closing in on him. It wasn't just about Officer Davis or the police anymore. It was about a war he had started, a war that was bigger than him, bigger than the neighborhood. It was about the fight for respect, for justice, and for a place in a world that had always made him feel small. But Jamal couldn't stop now. He couldn't let the fear win. Every inch of his body screamed for him to give up, to go back to the quiet life he once knew. But then he remembered the faces of the people who had looked up to him, the faces of the people who had walked with him, who had felt the same pain, the same humiliation. He couldn't let them down. Jamal's mind wandered back to the moments before the final rally. He had been to the community center earlier that day to meet with the others, to organize and prepare. The air was tense with anticipation, and Jamal could feel it deep in his bones. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the future of his community, for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. As he sat on the porch of his house later that evening, looking out at the street, the weight of what was to come pressed down on him. The sirens in the distance were constant, a reminder of the police presence, the power that hung over him like a storm waiting to break. And then there was the message. He had received a text from Elijah just a few hours before, a warning wrapped in the simplest of words. "They're coming for you, Jamal. It's all going to go down tomorrow. Be ready." Jamal wasn't sure what to make of it. The words had hit him hard, the gravity of them sinking deep into his chest. He had prepared himself for this moment, but even now, the uncertainty was enough to make him doubt everything he had done, everything he had worked for. His palms were slick with sweat as he wiped them on his jeans. Tomorrow, the day when everything would change. The rally began in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the streets. Jamal rolled up to the center of the crowd, his wheelchair moving through the crowd like a signal, a symbol that they were not alone. The energy was electric. People were chanting, raising their voices, demanding to be heard. It was a moment of unity, a moment of strength. But Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface. He could hear the voices around him, the people who had gathered to support him. But what he felt most deeply was the silence of the world that had ignored them for so long, the silence of the powerful, of those who held the keys to the system that had oppressed them. But not anymore. Today, Jamal was going to make sure that silence was broken. As Jamal made his way to the front of the crowd, he saw Officer Davis standing in the distance, his uniform sharp and menacing, his eyes locked onto Jamal with a gaze that sent a chill down his spine. Davis wasn't just standing there, he was watching, waiting. Jamal could feel the weight of his gaze, the animosity radiating off of him like a physical presence. But Jamal didn't flinch. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The rally continued, chants of justice rising higher and higher, filling the air. Jamal felt the power of the people around him, the strength of the movement. But he knew that Davis and the other officers were waiting for the right moment to strike, to show everyone who was in charge. Jamal could feel it. This wasn't just a protest, it was a battle. By the time the sun had set, the rally was in full swing, the air filled with the sound of raised fists and passionate voices. Jamal felt the heat of the moment rise inside him, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The world had never felt so alive. He wasn't just standing for himself anymore. He wasn't even just standing for the community. He was standing for every person who had ever been told they didn't matter, for every person who had been pushed to the edges of society, made to feel invisible. And in that moment, as the crowd chanted his name, as the voices of the people surged around him, Jamal realized that this was the moment he had been waiting for. This was the moment when the system that had oppressed him, and everyone like him, would have to face the truth. But it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be peaceful. Jamal could see the officers in the crowd, the way they moved, the way they positioned themselves, waiting for the right moment to act. The next few moments were a blur. The first push came from the officers. They moved forward, slowly, methodically, pushing through the crowd with heavy hands and hard stares. Jamal saw it happen before anyone else could react. The officers, with their guns and their badges, began shoving people to the ground, treating them like they were nothing more than obstacles to their power. Jamal's heart raced, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. The crowd erupted in chaos, some people running, others standing their ground, shouting at the officers to stop, to leave them alone. Jamal wheeled himself forward, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him, watching as the world he had fought for began to crumble in front of him. The injustice, the violence, it was all happening in front of his eyes. He saw Officer Davis step forward, his hand resting on his gun. He could feel the weight of that moment, the fear that came with knowing that one wrong move could change everything. Jamal's mind raced, but in that instant, he made a choice. He couldn't be afraid. Not now. With all the strength he could muster, Jamal wheeled himself into the crowd, pushing forward until he was right in front of Officer Davis. He didn't flinch, didn't back down, his eyes meeting Davis's with a quiet fury that spoke louder than words ever could. "This ends now," Jamal said, his voice rising above the chaos. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to treat us like we're nothing. We matter." For a moment, everything was still. The crowd was silent. The officers stood frozen, their eyes locked on Jamal, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. And then, slowly, Davis reached out, his hand brushing against the holster at his side, as if contemplating whether to strike. But before he could make a move, the sound of sirens in the distance pierced the air, growing louder and louder. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. The moment when everything changed. And then, as if the universe had decided to take control, the sirens grew louder still. But it wasn't just one car, it was many. Backup, reinforcements. The officers surrounding the crowd hesitated, looking up, realizing that the tide was about to turn. They couldn't stop it. Not now. And in that moment, Jamal saw something he hadn't expected. The crowd wasn't afraid anymore. The people who had once been afraid to speak, to fight, to rise up, were now standing tall. They weren't backing down. Officer Davis and his crew realized, too late, that they had underestimated the power of the people. They had underestimated the strength of a community united by one common goal: justice. Jamal stood his ground, his eyes locked on Officer Davis, and in that instant, he knew this fight, this movement, wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the scene quieted, the officers slowly began to retreat, their arrogance fading with every step. Jamal wheeled himself forward, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The people were still there, standing together, their chants of justice ringing through the streets. And Jamal knew in that moment that he had done something more than just stand up. He had sparked something, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished, a fire that would burn until the world had no choice but to listen. This was only the beginning, and Jamal was ready for whatever came next. The dawn of change had arrived, and nothing would stop them now. We'd love to hear what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? How do you feel about the themes of injustice and standing up for what's right? Your thoughts and experiences are important to us, and we deeply value each one of you. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It really helps us. We wish you a great day ahead, and if you've listened to the very end, leave us a comment with the phrase, "Change starts with us," so we know you followed the journey until the very last moment. Your voice matters. Thank you for being part of this conversation.